So welcome to the joint event of the Budapest City Archives and the Institute of Philosophy of Eötvös Loránd University, a lecture by Waldemar Bulira. First of all, a few words about the speaker, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I heard new information from him today. So Waldemar Bulira is a research fellow at the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism at the Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. He deals with contemporary political philosophy with a special focus on the problems of liberalism, totalitarianism, and the Holocaust. He has published several important articles on the philosophy of the Budapest School, the philosophy of Charles Taylor, on the problems of biopolitics, feminism, and new social movements. In 2006, he defended his doctoral dissertation on Ágnes Heller's theory on politics and modernity. He was co-translator and co-editor of the Polish language editions of Ágnes Heller's philosophical works. He was a co-organizer of Ágnes Heller's lecture series in Poland in 2005. His comprehensive monograph on Ágnes Heller's political philosophy was published in 2006. In 2018, he published a book in Polish on the critical theory of the Budapest School. First, I asked Waldemar Bulira to keep his presentation. After that, Gábor Kovács from the Institute of Philosophy will give a 10 or 15-minute speech on Waldemar's text. But now I give the floor to Waldemar Bulira.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Yes, I prepared a presentation of, let's say, lecture, which is quite long, so please let me read my lecture. Also, because I have some quotations, so it will be easier for me and probably faster. The title of my presentation is "School Will Never Smile Again." Leszek Kołakowski and Ágnes Heller's critique of the Western New Left. At the beginning, a few impressions, maybe as a kind of introduction. I have to admit that from the very beginning of my contacts with the figure of Ágnes Heller and her philosophy, I was accompanied by Leszek Kołakowski, the Polish philosopher. It was they, actually, who, in their own way, introduced me to the world of philosophy, primarily political philosophy. Why I'm talking about Kołakowski and Heller together? According to me, and probably not only to me, there are real connections between them. For me, Ágnes and Leszek, their fates, their life experiences, attitudes, some existential choices, decision made sometimes out of necessity were very similar. I could also say that they were paradigmatic for a whole generation of intellectuals hailing from this part of Europe, who came to live in this shortest century in human history. This awareness of the affinity between Heller and Kołakowski has come back to me several times over the past few years. I will briefly mention three such occasions. The first occurred here in Budapest. It so happened that when I visited Ágnes, it was probably the last time I saw her, at her apartment in late 2016, I had with me a book That was two-volume book, a long interview with Leszek Kołakowski, conducted by Zbigniew Mencel, it's a Polish author. This book was my reading for stay in Budapest, and this book also contains photos of Kołakowski from different periods of his life. I've showed those books to Ágnes, who hosted me for several hours, and she looked at them photos for a very long time, with incredible intensity, tenderness, and emotion. She gently touched the photographs, returning again and again to those she had looked at literally a moment ago. All the time she was also repeating in a whisper to herself, Leszek, Leszek. This was several years after the death of Kołakowski, who passed away in 2009. That's the first image I had in my mind. The second situation is related to the death of Ágnes herself, 10 years later. I was asked by some Polish academic journal, which defines itself as leftist, to write a short text memoir about Heller as a person, as a philosopher. I did it. A few days later, I sent the finished text to the editors, who, however, finally decided not to publish this not so long paper. The reason was simple. It turned out that both the text itself and Ágnes were not considered sufficiently leftist. All of this because I mentioned, for example, her critical attitude to contemporary feminism. I compare her in some distance with some American leftist philosophers, liberal philosophers, and so on. It was something inappropriate. A leftist shouldn't criticize those authors, movements that define themselves as leftist. That was the answer from editors, especially if we are talking about a student of Lukács. This grotesque situation made me appreciate even more the lessons I took from Ágnes. First and foremost, that the world is not black and white, and that one should always speak out about what one considers wrong, even if his words do not meet with appreciation. And the last situation, which maybe explain also why I decided to talk also about Leszek Kołakowski. This year, while reading a biography of Polish famous philosopher and sociologist Zygmunt Bauman by one of the Polish writers of younger generation, Archívum, I again had a similar story. There was a passage in the book in which Domosławski described Kołakowski as a traitor to the left. A traitor who, with his emigration work as well as his text in the 90s, contributed to Poles massively abandoning the ideas of socialism and becoming uncritical protagonist of free market and capitalism. Domosławski belittles Kołakowski's importance to Polish society and culture in recent decades, portraying him as an unreflective, especially irresponsible advocate of system based on exploitation, inequality, and consumption. Kołakowski's narrow-mindedness is to be particularly seen, according to Domosławski, in comparison with Bauman, who, although he also went into forced exile in 1968, remained true to the ideas of the left. Domosławski refers to Kołakowski as a militant conservative thinker close to the right. I must admit that these three situations, or images, or experiences, again made me think of Ágnes without forgetting Leszek Kołakowski and vice versa. This is one of the reasons why I will try to tell about the affinities of the thoughts. I would like to focus especially on those fields that made their own political, intellectual environment on the left look critically at their work and attitudes for a long time, and as we can see, even after their death. I will omit some parts of my presentation because it's too long. And let me start my story in 1968. In this year, Leszek Kołakowski was forced to leave Poland. This year was also significant for the future fate of Heller, who at that time was condemned by Hungarian state authorities as a result of her protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops. In a few years later, she, with the other members of the Budapest school, had to leave her home for a long time. Kołakowski, I will start with Kołakowski. Kołakowski was leaving Poland as one of the famous and important Eastern European Marxist philosophers, although according to himself, at that time of his departure, his association with Marxism was a thing of the past. This is evidenced by the very fact that on his departure, he took with him the manuscript of the first volume of his famous book, Main Currents of Marxism, a work with which he wanted to settle account with Marxist doctrine and political system that sought legitimacy in Marxism. The settlement nature of this work is already evidenced by its subtitles. The first volume is Rise, the second Development, and the last one, Decomposition. The Western left was so reluctant to this work that its third volume, Decomposition, for example, wasn't translated into French because the publisher feared the reaction of French leftist circles. What's more, even the title of the second volume was changed. The neutral word development was replaced by the French word which means golden age. Obviously, it was at odds with Kołakowski's intentions. In fact, Kołakowski came to the West as a thinker who had already closed his Marxist past behind him. As he said in one interview, let me quote, I wasn't interested in being a Marxist or being called one. What would that mean, anyway? I explained dozens of times that the spiritual offspring of Marx had ceased to be a place of identification for me. Of course, I was ready to admit, as any educated person is, that Marx had done something important in the intellectual history of Europe, that he was an important figure, but that the breadth of influence that Marxists had gained was not the result of its scientific qualities, but conversely, dependent on its imaginative, irrational aspects. In fact, after all, almost all of Marx's prophecies turned out to be false. End of quotation. The declaration about the decline of Marxism was treated as a blasphemy in the West, especially in Western University that time. Kołakowski made his position clear in a famous essay. It was a kind of open letter he addressed in 1974 to Edward P. Thompson, one of the most important figures of the New Left in Great Britain. It was an important text for two reasons. On the one hand, it was important because Kołakowski openly and definitively broke with the left in it. But on the other hand, it was also important because As I said, Polish philosopher wrote that essay in response to an attack from A.P. Thompson, and we will see that the views exhibited by Thompson and his followers, so-called unilateralism, also provoked already in exile a reaction from Ágnes, Heller and Ferenc Fehér. As I said, I will discuss it later. Kołakowski ironically titled his text "My Correct Views on Everything." As I said, it was published in 1974 in the Social Register as a response to open letter to Leszek Kołakowski, which E.P. Thompson had published in the same magazine a year earlier. In his letter, Thompson formulates accusation against the Polish philosopher. First and foremost, he accuses him of betraying the ideals of socialism, which was apparently revealed by Kołakowski in an interview given a little earlier to Encounter, the magazine which, according to the Western left, collaborated with CIA. Of course, this alone was enough to discredit Kołakowski in Thompson's eyes. Also, the most serious allegations concern Kołakowski's views presented in that interview. According to Thompson, Kołakowski became a thinker who was closer to liberalism or even reactionary conservatism than to Marxism. Thompson doesn't hide his disappointment, since he had associated with Kołakowski the hope of revitalization of Marxism. He cannot accept the fact that Kołakowski undermines the very idea of socialism and the belief in the any possibility or even the need for renewal of Marxism. So he calls Kołakowski a traitor who rejects leftist identity, siding with capitalism, liberal democracy, and maybe especially religion, which was seen by Polish philosopher as an integral part of social life. Thompson is also surprised by the criticism of student movements, which for him represent the hope that the idea of a world revolution is not yet dead. Here, the English historian speaks of the enthusiasm and strength of those movements, which may be somewhat chaotic or noisy, but nevertheless, the participants reject capitalism, seek to build a just society of the future. For this reason, actually, any criticism of those movements is not appropriate. And now Kołakowski's retort, which in my opinion is masterful, is one of the best essays I ever read. Kołakowski not only, in my opinion, accurately and mercilessly exposes the absurdities and naivety of the thinking of the new left at that time, but he does it in a magnificent style. He expresses his disillusionment with the Western left, which in his view, as I said, is naive, and uses dual criteria of value. He writes, let me quote, "I simply refuse to join people who show how their hearts are bleeding to death when they hear about any, big or minor, injustice in the US, and suddenly become wise historiosophists or cool rationalists when told about the worst horrors of the new alternative society." End of quotation. Kołakowski is ironic in this vein throughout the whole text. For example, he writes about the fact that the word freedom, in reference to the Western world, is used by the people of the left in quotation marks, because according to them, freedom in the West is just a joke. It is interesting, Kołakowski says, that only the newcomers from behind the iron curtain do not laugh at this joke. Why? Because because they know this true freedom which was lacked formal bourgeois safeguards, and as a result is dependent on the will of the party authorities to guard it. He says ironically, the next quotation, "We got rid of this fraudulent bourgeois device of the division of powers, and we achieved the socialist dream of unity, which means that the same apparatus has all legislative, executive, and judicial power, in addition to its power of controlling of all means of production. The same people make law, interpret it, and enforce it. What better social unity can you imagine?" End of quotation. This kind of argumentation leads Kołakowski to the conclusion. It's a very long essay, so to the conclusion that well-functioning social or communist society not only does not exist, but simply is not possible. This idea has not passed the test. It has been verified by reality, as evidenced by the fate of millions of residents of the Eastern Bloc countries. In mentioned essay, Kołakowski has a particular dislike for the aforementioned 68 student movements, whose sympathizers he accuses not only of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and use of simplistic schemes of thinking, but above all of primitivism and extreme barbarism. He recalls his experiences as a visiting professor at Berkeley at the very beginning of his immigration, and his contact with student revolutionaries as follows. The next quotation. Needless to say, we could hear that there is no difference at all between the life in California campus and a Nazi concentration camp. And all revolutionary students were Marxist, of course, which meant that they knew 3 or 4 sentences written by Marx or Lenin. In particular, the sentence, "The philosophers have only interpreted the word in various ways." The point, however, is to change it. What Marx wanted to say in this sentence, it's obvious to them, was that it made no sense to learn. End of quotation. And it's precisely because of these experiences that Kołakowski pays special attention to defending the institution of the university, which was fought against by mentioned movements as a symbol of the fascist oppression of students called by Kołakowski as the most oppressed and the most revolutionary class of society. Kołakowski mentioned comical and dramatic situations in this essay. Comical situation where, for example, philosophy students protesting the necessity of reading the classic of Western philosophy like Plato, Descartes, and other bourgeois fools, whom they were forced to read instead of the works of real thinkers like Che Guevara and Mao. He mentioned also a dramatic situation, such as torching the university libraries in the USA when irrelevant pseudo-knowledge of the establishment was being destroyed. Kołakowski's narrative is indeed full of humor, irony, and sarcasm, but one must admit that it's a kind of laughter through tears. The Polish philosopher is concerned with the consequences of 68 revolution. His conclusions are as follows. This is not a farce capable of turning upside down the society, but it is capable of destroying the university, and this is a performance worth worrying about. Some German universities look already like party schools. The end of quotation. Kołakowski speaks here from the perspective of an academic who himself experienced the differences between an open or liberal, as he called it, university and a totalitarian one. In turn, the demands of the revolutionized students fit precisely into what Kołakowski calls the political or simply totalitarian idea of the university. According to such an idea, as he puts in the other essay published 1 year later, titled Neutrality and Academic Values, according to such an idea, there are no such things as human values that transcend the particular interest of warring political groups. According to Kołakowski, the students' movements advocated a politicized or totalitarian university. In response to such views, students and junior faculty members at the University of Frankfurt protested the idea that he should be the one to hold the chair of philosophy. After the late Theodor Adorno, Kołakowski was proposed took such a proposal from Habermas after his return from Berkeley. Eventually, the Polish philosopher took a job at Oxford, and Habermas himself also said later that Kołakowski's arrival into the West was a disaster for the Western left. To sum up, in this cited essay, Kołakowski declares the death of God. In his view, both the Marxist idea and the practice of socialist society have died and should be left alone. Alas, poor idea, he concludes, paraphrasing Hamlet's word from the scene in the cemetery. I knew it, Edward. This skull will never smile again. Ágnes Heller went into forced immigration about a decade after Kołakowski's departure. Her stay in the West also began with a confrontation with leftist circle. This conflict was due to the statements and publications of Hungarian exiles about the USSR and the peculiarities of life in the reality of existing socialist society. The first such a commentary was the joint book Dictatorship Over Needs, written earlier but published in 1983. The first idea of this book was presented by, as far as I remember, by Feher in some short paper in some journal in America. In this book, Heller, Ferenc Feher and Georgi Markus exposed the contradiction and oppressive nature of system under analysis. They did so partly in the spirit of revisionist Marxism. Feher and Markus used the category of need, but also went beyond Marx, especially Heller, who in her part of the book was inspired mainly by Max Weber's thought. They dedicated this book, as they wrote in the introduction, primarily to the Western left, because they wanted to open the eyes of its supporters to the criminal and absurd nature of the Soviet system that Western leftists uncritically supported. The differences between Hungarian immigrants and Western leftists were getting deeper day by day. The main cause was popularity among the Western left of the idea of unilateral Western concessions to the USSR, mentioned before, unilateralism, the idea propounded precisely by Edward P. Thompson.
This issue became the subject of small book written by Heller and Fächer, published in 1986, entitled Doomsday or Deterrence on the Anti-Nuclear Issue. Heller recalls the context of the work as follows in one interview. Let me quote. Our book against the anti-nuclear movements was primarily about the disarmament movements operating in Western Germany. It all started trivially. Ferry and I were already in exile at that time. During one of my visits to Europe, I was invited to Bonn for a large demonstration for peace. The organizers has asked me to speak, and I spoke in their spirit. And then I listened to the speeches after mine, and I realized how wrong I was. I wanted to speak for a second time, and I said that everything I had heard just before was wrong. Everything was different. What was the peace movement, I realized only then. They wanted to make us believe that the Soviet Union was a great peaceful state and America was the greatest danger in the whole world. America was going to the world and the Soviet Union was poor and peaceful. I said that it was totally false. Then I came home and I told Ferry that maybe this kind of anti-nuclear movement was a kind of German nationalism. Because Germans maybe could not tolerate that they had been liberated by these terrible democratic countries. So now they use a nationalism of the motto, we are different. In a way, I think I was right. Then we were sitting down with Ferry and writing book about a nuclear weapon as deterrence. Basically, it was against this peace movement. And look, it's a great that at the time it was very isolated at the left, but after the system changed, when the archives were opened, it turned out that they had really been organized by Russian informants and agents. End of quotation. In Doomsday and Deterrence, we find the first analysis of the new social movements that originated from the 68 student movements, which, as we remember, were criticized by Kołakowski. On the one hand, those movements were presented as a phenomenon with enormous democratic potential. By their very mode of action, their inclusive nature, the goals they set for themselves, that is, for instance, emancipation, the fight against social injustice and environmental degradation, and so on, they seems to have introduced a new quality into the modern public sphere. But on the other hand, Heller and Fächer's overall attitude towards them was rather negative. It seems to me that it can be explained in two ways. First, as can be seen in Heller's statement cited above, these movements were at the very least politically irresponsible. Second, the Hungarian authors criticized them also in theoretical terms, from theoretical perspective. In this case, the point was that these movements practice so-called political of redemption. That's the subject developed by Fächer in a few papers, which in turn manifests itself in participants of movements operating with a specific Manichaean and pseudo-religious justified vision of the world, which was suddenly about to face total annihilation. At the same time, these movements offered no meaningful alternative to the allegedly impending annihilation. By confronting the adherents with the necessity of choosing between life and death, the anti-nuclear movements were in fact harming the foundation of the modern world. Acceptance of this fundamental false alternative, in turn, carried serious practical consequences. In fact, the life or death alternative confronted people with the necessity of choosing between the two values of life and freedom that, according to Budapestians, are central to modernity. In siding with life, supporters of the anti-nuclear movement followed the Bertrand Russell's famous motto, better red than dead, which in the language of real international politics at the same time simply meant willingness to make far-reaching concessions to the USSR. This in turn entailed agreeing to a greater or lesser restrictions on the freedom of societies and individuals within Soviet sphere of influence. Heller and further critique of the new social movements, the New Left, which, let me repeat, originated from students' movements, evolved into a critique of so-called biopolitics. Their short essay from 1984, titled From Red to Green, played an important role in this evolution. Here, the authors again point out that the actions of the new social movements, Greens, create a conflict between two main values of the modern world, freedom and life. In their view, by the mid-80s, Western leftist social movements had undergone an evolution that was as rapid as astonishing. While at the very beginning, in the 60s, the participants of this movement firmly sided with value of freedom. In the 80s, they took life as the most important values. Thus, the traditional left became the new left. However, as it turned out, in less than 2 decades, it too lost its allure of youth and became ossified. This was due to the fact that by siding with the value of life, which in this view becomes a value opposed to freedom, the new left formation lost their emancipatory potential. In keeping with the metaphor of the title of the mentioned essay, the supporters of the left also changed their language from red to green. The red language, let me quote, typical of the 60s, was a language of stigmatization, was a language that stigmatized alienation. That was anti-authoritarian language, while the left of the 80s uses a green language that speaks of the pollution and contamination of nature. As a consequence of this transformation, the new left begins to care first and foremost about human being, but human being understood here in terms of species. Recognizing the real and potential dangers lurking in front of humanity, it seeks a strong enough ally that would be able to counter them. Such an ally turns out to be the state, its institutions, services and agencies, as well as the existing political parties with which, in the name of higher goals, the representatives of the new left begin to enter into alliances and agreements. In other words, the new green left no longer seeks to correct the injustice that exists in the societies of Western modernity. It is no longer interested in the struggle against enslavement and reification of individuals. It becomes passive on those issues, resulting in its increasing dependence on the state. It abandons the language of freedom and emancipation, and its representatives begin to speak the language of biopolitics, dominated by issue of healthy food, chemical and nuclear threats to the environment, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. The value of life is clearly pushing the value of freedom off the pedestal. A proper analysis of biopolitics can be found in another, also quite small book written by Heller and Fech, titled just Biopolitics. They present biopolitics there as ambiguous phenomenon. On the one hand, it was born and became widespread as a form of radical democratic politics that made emancipatory demands. At the same time, however, and this is the other point of view, the problem of biopolitics is that it postulates the emancipation of collective subjects, which in turn raises great concerns for our authors. Here, I think the general theory of modernity constructed by a duo of Hungarian authors since the 80s make itself apparent. The major form of this theory we can find especially in a book written by Heller after the death of Fächer, I mean a theory of modernity, but also in many of her papers in which he diagnosed the contingent nature of modern individuals' existence. According to this view, modern man is born as a contingent being, that is, one who does not have predetermined telos of his existence. This means that modern man becomes the master of his own fate. It's up to him who he will become and what social hierarchy, social structure he will predestine for himself. At the same time, a recipe for his contingency is a kind of existential gesture, the moment when an individual destines himself to one role or another, to one place or another in society. The Hungarian authors at the modern world, including the phenomenon of biopolitics, from the perspective of an individual, the rights and freedom that belongs to him. This means, among other things, that in modernity it is an individual who becomes a proper subject of all political actions, with automatically centered around the problem of substantialization of the value of freedom. Biopolitics violates the autonomy of an individual. This is because it doesn't treat an individual in accordance with Kant's maxim as an end in itself. For the proponents of biopolitics, an individual matters insofar as it is a component of something larger than he, she. Therefore, the actions of biopolitical movements are constructed around collective subjects and directed toward the realization of their political goals and the values they recognize. But for Heller and Fächer, the problem is that such entities simply do not exist. Only an individual is a real existing entity, and as such, only he, she can make an existential choice. A choice of this kind cannot be made by a collective entity because such an entity not only doesn't have an individual identity, but even, as I said, simply doesn't exist. It's a kind of creation. Therefore, collective identities, as dependent on individual choices, should not dominate over individual identities. According to this view, the kind of biopolitics we deal with here is a version of identity politics characterized by an implicit oppressiveness towards its adherents. It is based on the assumption that individuals have a coherent, predominant and definitive identity, thanks to which they can fully, consciously participate in politics, thus pursuing their own, though somehow objectively, by definition, assigned interest. Such an approach obviously assumes that an individual, his goals aspirations, and so on, is determined by the identity he acquires due to the fact that he is characterized by certain biological traits. For example, being a woman, one acquires a feminine identity and therefore must do what a woman should do. An individual with a sexual preference should look at the world as someone with a particular sexual orientation. Belonging to an ethnic minority to recognize those values held by other representatives of that minority, and so on. An individual I melts into the collective we. In extreme cases, as said, tyranny is born out of biopolitical movements. The orientation of modern political action that we are dealing with in the case of biopolitics, involving the depreciation and violation of individual autonomy in the name of collective values, very clearly brings those movements closer to such dangerous political phenomena in modernity as fundamentalism. Fundamentalist attitudes stem primarily from the biopolitical movements' reductionist view of the world of human affairs, supported by the holistic ontology preferred by the proponents. Proponents of biopolitics interpret all the problems of modern world exclusively through the prism of their interest. Such a one-sided understanding of reality forcefully distorts it, creates a false picture of it. As a result of such an attitude, a black and white way of seeing the world, which, by the way, is typical for any grand narrative, such attitude, such perspective is produced. In many papers, in many interviews, Heller called contemporary feminism as a kind of grand narrative, for instance. Thanks to this simplified vision of the social world, supporters of a particular biopolitical movement can clearly and definitively define and separate the good, truthful, and bad, imperfect qualities of reality. On the basis of such an attractive because enticingly simplistic vision of the world, they consider themselves the guardians of good and true, surrounded by lurking emissaries of evil and falsehood, that is by actually all those who simply do not agree with them. This leads to a situation in which any criticism or even polemical voice against the position or actions of a given movement will be unequivocally branded with the stigma of, let's say, racist, sexist, or homophobic. This kind of one-sided dialogue begins to reduce the real dialogue to the requirements, to the rules of positive discrimination as the phenomenon of political correctness. Okay, let me quickly summarize my presentation. Both Kołakowski and Heller came to the West as radical leftist thinkers. However, it soon became apparent that due to their own personal experiences of living under the condition of a socialist society of Soviet provenance, they were unable and unwilling to take the side of the Western left simply because it was appropriate for them as leftist intellectuals to do so. What is more, from the very beginning of their exile, they strike at the Western left, which appears to them not only somewhat cynical, but also very naive and especially irresponsible. The criticism seems to have a broader basis. I think it reflects well the attitude to any ideology that projects a one-dimensional view of the world. It seems that in light of their own personal experiences, I mean totalitarianism, and so on, their critical sense has been sensitized to the negative tendencies of the modern world. No matter with what adjective they have been described, leftist, rightist, revolutionary, reactionary, radical, conservative, and so on. This critical sense advocated itself when the founding value of freedom in this world is in danger. For the greatest threat to freedom comes from the extreme phenomena, attitudes that are both mutually exclusive and somehow also mutually conditional. Fundamentalism on the one hand, on the other, relativism. They are the ones to be wary of, they are the ones to be stigmatized, and as far as possible to their influence on the public life of modern society should be limited. This is all the more important because the times and circumstances in which we live, most often characterized by the motto anything goes, are exceptionally conducive to such tendencies. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, first of all, thank you for my invitation. Laci, I am honored to be here in this excellent company. So, maybe about 15 minutes in my comments, fragmented ruminations, Ágnes Heller. What I am talking about here is the problem of biopolitics and conservatism. Waldemar poses the question, can Heller and Kołakowski really be imagined as conservative thinkers? My remarks will be concentrated upon some texts of Ágnes Heller and Ferenc Fehér relevant concerning the problems of biopolitics. We cannot forget the fact that the theory of modernity and postmodern condition was a common project of them, evolved from the first years of the emigration to the unfortunately early deaths of Fehér. What I am doing here in the case of Heller is the scratching of the surface of a many-colored and rich oeuvre. What concerns Kołakowski, having read very few texts of him, I am not in the position to take definite assertions. I have some superficial impressions on his philosophical, intellectual, political position, but I am not sharing it with you. It would be some kind of hubris. So, in case of Heller and Fehér, the problem of biopolitics is embedded in a many-layered theory of modernity. The conception emerged during the 80s and the 90s, and the conceptual framework of it was the blurred and debated phase of postmodern condition. However, it was a widely used catchword at the time. It was mentioning the contrast to our days. The concept has lost its popularity enjoyed in the former period, in the years before and after the great political transformation in Eastern Europe, in the years the collapse of the USSR and with its the elimination of the so-called existing socialism in the Soviet Empire and its satellite states. The problems of modernity appear in the context of refusal of the grand narratives and utopias connected to them. The term modernity was used with different adjectives, late modernity, capitalist modernity, and so on. However, the notion of postmodern seemed to give an adequate referential framework to dissident philosophers disappointed in the grand narrative of the Marxian philosophy, but defined themselves as radicals and did not want to choose the option of an anti-modern approach of cultural criticism based on a pessimistic mood concerning the fate of modernity. Heller Fehér, given in advance the conclusion of my train of thought, using the referential framework of postmodern, hoped the possibility to persist in the position of thinkers embracing the notion of dynamic modernity, with it the idea of continuing emancipation without a pink utopia of inevitable progress in all fields of modernity from technology and economy to politics and everyday life. It meant the refusal of social physics à la Comte, with its determinism warranting the good happy end of the grand narrative of modernity. The idea of contingency, as we mentioned, as a central motif of different postmodern conceptions, promised the chance for preserving a terrain for human agency. However, we cannot assure certain advantageous outcomes, but, say the postmodern, paying the price of an uncertain future, we are at least able to open the door of the iron cage of the modernity, absolutely predestined by the different system logics. Fehér and Heller, in a series of writings from the early 80s to the years before the millennium, Fehér died in 1994, gave a very sophisticated theory, remaining within the referential framework of postmodern thought about the phenomenology of late modernity. This theory is burdened of inner tensions. It is a characteristic that gives the dynamism and openness of their concept. It stimulates debate. It's no chance that it provoked critical interpretations mainly for the thinkers positioning themselves as leftists, meaning left in a wider meaning as a catchword or an umbrella notion for different approaches. The starting point of Heller and Fehér is that postmodern condition is within modernity, not a new age or a new epoch, but a new constellation. As they write it in their grand essay, The Modernity's Pendulum, we are able to destroy modernity, but we are not able to surpass it. If the devastation is successful, we are condemned to live among the ruins of modernity. The metaphor of the modernist pendulum plays a central place in their thought. It promises an advantage. Using it is possible to keep the picture of a dynamic modernity in its central dynamic justice, giving a chance for preserving the idea and practice of emancipation without the determinism inherent in the idea of an unlimited progress. It gives a possibility for forgetting about an economic, social, political machine rolling further in an unstoppable manner in the broad avenue of progress. At the same time, a metaphor is a metaphor. That is, it is a perceptive, picture-like, it appeals for imagination, but it always carries the danger of the overburdening. The main question, what or who gives impetus for swinging of the pendulum? There are two candidates for this role. The different system logics of modernity, on the one hand, the human agency on the other hand. The main problem is the explanation of the coactivity of these candidates. Fehér, in an essay written in 1993, referring to their former above-mentioned common writing with Heller, appeared a year earlier, summarizes the conception about the dominating system logics of modernity and the relation to human agency. It's a quotation. These logics have been identified as the developmental trends of technology, the functional division of labor, and the experimentation with statecraft. Modernity's pendulum, a chart of modernity's dynamic, would only be drawn on this basis. The pendulum can only swing in a world where modernity has globally broken through. All major impetuses that constitute the swing of the pendulum come from society, hence the pendular character of the dynamic. The overarching metaphor of the theory tells us that here no attempt is made to create a pseudo-science of social energetics. It is rather the hermeneutical category of the horizon that is being used here. Human actors want to reach their horizon. Whenever recognition dawns upon the actors that they have reached their limit, the impetus would touch base and swing in a new direction. End of the quotation. The train of thought tries to reconcile the ideas of alienated system logics and human agency. Pendulum appears both a self-correcting mechanism of modernity and the realization of human agency, based on a freedom. The methodological problem is that it seems to be rather a description than an explanation. But we have to disregard from it and have to deal with the basic question, what moves human actors for action? The answer, their needs. This brings us back to the Marxist period of Ágnes Heller. She wrote a seminal book about the problem of radical needs in the historical philosophy of Karl Marx, published in 1974, entitled The Theory of Need in Marx. The problem of radical needs cannot be satisfied within the capitalist economic political arrangement and can function as a lever for surpassing capitalism. It was one of the central topics of the Western New Left. Heller, later looking back, labeled this book as one of the first new leftist work to the problem of radical needs. However, in her post-Marxist period, in the context of the theory about postmodern condition, the problem of needs remains a key category. The dynamism of modernity is fed on the dynamism of an unrestricted need structure. Heller explains in a detailed manner why the category of needs are so important for understanding the dynamic of modernity in her essay entitled On Being Satisfied in a Dissatisfied Society. General dissatisfaction of modern individuals with their fates, with their social status, with their incomes, with their prestiges, etc., according to her, is a basic motivation for their deeds. It is inseparable from the feeling of contingency. The latter is a presupposition of freedom enjoyed by them, which lagged from the pre-modern societies based on rigid social hierarchy, predetermining the social status for everyone. Heller's conclusion, I quoting it, dissatisfaction keeps all institutions going and that is inherent in each of them, end of the quotation. It is in the postmodern political condition, this quotation. In this point of her train of thought appears the notion of imagination as a connecting link between the institutions, that is the different system logics, and the individuals living in the world of regular life. This concept has been explained in another seminal essay entitled The Three Logics of Modernity and the Double Bind of Modern Imagination. She is telling apart two kinds of modern imaginations: historical imagination with its past orientation and technical imagination with its future orientation. This essay is evidently relevant from the perspective of the topics of my paper because Heller here introduces the notion pair of life versus freedom, which brings us to the problems of biopolitics and her political affiliation in the post-Marxist period, to the question posed by Waldemar: can she be classified as a conservative thinker? It was mentioning that in this essay appears the name of Hannah Arendt, whose political philosophy is a very important point of orientation for Ágnes Heller in whole life. At the same time, we cannot forget that she interprets and reinterprets of the Arendtian thought from the perspective of her own conception. The framework of the concept of political for Arendt is eminently the word of the Greek polis, with its hierarchical society ensuring the spaces of freedom only for the citizens of city. The males possessing the right to enter the stage of the politics, they were a minority of the inhabitants of the city. Albeit later Arendt, treating the modern American Revolution of the late 18th century in her book entitled On Revolutions, explains a new version of theory about political freedom in modernity. All in all, she persisted to see the history of modernity as a story of decline, as a Verfallsgeschichte. This concept is in the center of her opus magnum, The Human Condition, published in 1958. Durability, which according to Arendt is very important for creating the spaces of freedom, is endangered by the consumerism of modern world. Modernity is devouring the solid durable structures. At the same time, for Heller, contingency and volatility rendering by it are the basic preconditions of modern freedom, which paradoxically is a non-grounding ground of modernity. What concerns the problem of consumerism, as John Grumley in his essay on Heller points out, there is an undeniable ambivalence in Heller's theory. However, in Heller's thought, this problem appears in the context of need theory. Here she makes distinction between needs and wants. The unrestrictedness of needs is a presupposition of individual autonomy. Among modern conditions, they are inseparable from the wants of consumerism. Heller, in a postmodern manner, abstains from a verdict, leaves open the dilemma. I am quoting her. It is not usual to presume that needs for self-determination are, to a greater or lesser extent, present in the overwhelming majority of modern individuals, but it is equally reasonable to assume that their satisfaction is sought indirectly rather than directly through the avenue of vote satisfaction. In the normal runs of events, it is fair to say that people will exhibit reluctance to participate in experiments for self-determination if they have reason to suspect that certain wants, in particular material ones, will not be met, or even that they will not be met to the extent that they are at present. End of the quotation. It is undeniable that the question of conservatism in the case of Heller can be posed because of her persistent refusal of biopolitics. It's a red string in her writings. Her conception on the problems of feminism, gender, race, sex at first sight seems to run parallel with the conservative point of view. But the philosophical background behind this refusal is not conservative. It's my point of view. The problem of biopolitics emerges, as you mentioned, in an early essay written together with Ferenc Fehér from Red to Green in 1948. They published a common book in 1994 about the topic biopolitics. 2 years later, in 1996, Heller returned to the topic in an essay giving a summary of her conception with a long title, Has Biopolitics Changed the Concept of the Political? Some further thoughts about biopolitics. But it's interesting here that she expands her train of thought in a definitely Arendtian referential framework. Arendt, according to her, is the only modern thinker who took seriously, I am quoting, the intrusion of bio-identity into the political sphere, end of the quotation. Heller's starting point and Arendt's starting point is the dichotomy of life and freedom. It's interesting, it's this question in the shadow of the COVID. There was a very strong debate 3 years ago, which was initiated by Agamben. It's a very, very sharp, he gave very, very sharp criticism, if you remember. So, there are really life and freedom. It's interesting in this last, to my opinion, to my mind, the last her writing, his writing in this topic, so some very, very strong assertions, very, very strong critique of biopolitics. Heller explains biopolitics is a self-contradiction. The biological sphere and political sphere must remain mutually closed for each other. Basic thought of Arendt, of course. The so-called biopolitics means the renaturalization of the political sphere. Moreover, it totalizes the notion of difference and eliminates universalist approach, which is the base of an egalitarian emancipative ethos, which is very, very important for Heller to the end of her life. Political community, as an end result of this ideology, falls apart to little segments of micro discourses unable to communicate with each other, lacking a common vocabulary. What makes the phenomenon more threatening, according to Heller, it is the propensity to collectivism to the detriment of individual opinions. It excludes the possibility of real debate. The actual group opinion represented by opinion leaders is obligatory for the members. Who explains his/her individual point of view risks his/her expulsion from the group. Biopolitics, all in all, Heller argues in this essay, not a political discourse in an Arendtian meaning, but a power discourse in the spirit of the theory of Carl Schmitt on the foe and friend. The antidote, according to Heller, is an updated Arendtian referential framework in which social questions, which Arendt in her political ontology expelled from this field, become political problems. Arendt refused this option, of course, but for Heller it's a way out. This solution, because what gain comes from it? Heller's answer, biopolitical topics are losing their biological nature or character. They can be treated in the framework of real political discourse based on argumentation, confronting different individual opinions. As a conclusion, what concerns the post-Marxist Ágnes Heller political affiliation, according to my opinion, republicanism or radical republicanism, more suitable label than conservatism. Her narrative of modernity, as we saw it, is not a conservative narrative. The resignation and pessimism of the conservative cultural criticism is missing from her thought. Arendtian referential framework is intertwined with an emancipative narrative flavored with a postmodern approach. Thank you for attention.
Thank you for that deep analysis of the problem of modernity and the biopolitics as well. It isn't easy, but you have the opportunity to reply on that text or that new presentation.
Shortly, yes, in my opinion, she's not a conservative thinker, especially in this political sense of this notion. Yes, in her in the second period of her philosophy, this post-Marxist, or maybe it's better to call it postmodern, I don't know. The Marx is still there. Some notions of taken from Marxism are still there, especially the notion of need, as you mentioned, this concept of dissatisfied society. We can find this concept in many papers. It is a chapter in I don't remember, postmodern political condition maybe, but there are also some small papers in which she returned in this way to Marx. But I will also connect the notion of need, the vision of dissatisfied society, with the concept of dynamic justice. It's, in my opinion, something there is a kind of affinity between those notions. Dynamic justice, which is a modern invention, right? This kind of justice, which is typical for modern society, the need of justice as a kind of this force who move the pendulum. Dynamic justice as a hope as well, that the modern society can survive, as we remember the title of one of the collection of essays, just because it means that modern life and modern society, modern world is still, let's say, open, that nothing is finished, that we still can try to make this world more justice. There will be no finish of this process, because this process is essential to modernity. If there is still a hope that we can change our world, make it more just, that's something what is the most important in her, according to me, in her philosophy. And that's the problem also of biopolitical movement, because according to them, from this perspective, dynamic justice is something what we have to refute. I mean, biopolitical movement don't want to make a world more just, but they want to establish the only and the final just society. They want to stop the process. That's the danger. because without the process, without the pendulum, there's no hope that something can be better, and that's the problem also with biopolitical movements. That's also is connected, of course, with her analysis of totalitarian system we can find in Dictatorship Over Needs, where there is a part in which totalitarian society is defined as a political society. And political society is the aim of biopolitical movements. Why? Because we can change our lives if we become this green left. I mean, this left which can cooperate with the state and can change injustice from above, right? So the aim of biopolitical movements from this perspective is to politicize maybe not the whole life of individual, but many those aspects which seems to be private to individual. So I would end in this way. Agnes many times said that her theory of modernity or perspective on modernity is only one of many, that she doesn't want to show us the final vision of modernity, that she doesn't want to formulate any philosophical system in which, as I remember, she said in Lublin, everything clicks. But I would say that from some perspective, maybe it is not a system, but it is really a theory of modernity in which almost all elements she elaborates on are really connected with each other. Sorry for my chaotic small talk, but maybe I will stop at this moment here. Thank you.